with the beginning. First of all, thank you very much for everybody who is joining us at the moment, all over the world, and we're of course are very thankful for it. The title of this panel is "What is Happening in Venezuela: Perspectives from the Left on a Just and Democratic Transition." Before we begin, I would like to introduce, since this is a bilingual event, I would like to introduce two of our interpreters, Adriana and Vanessa, and they will explain a little bit of the dynamic of the translation and interpreting process. Let me say this one more time in Spanish. Ya creo que podemos comenzar. Muchas gracias a todos los que están presentes en el momento, de todos lados del mundo. El título del panel es ¿Qué está ocurriendo en Venezuela? Perspectivas desde la izquierda y una democracia justa y una transición democrática justa. Como dije anteriormente en inglés, antes de que comencemos, le voy a dar el espacio tanto a Adriana como a Vanessa, que son nuestras intérpretes, para que expliquen un poquito cómo va a ser la dinámica de este proceso de interpretación y traducción dentro del panel. So, Adriana, go ahead.
Gracias. Hola, hola. Saludos. Mi nombre es Adriana y estoy aquí con mi compa Vanessa para ser sus intérpretes de hoy y proveer la justicia del lenguaje aquí en este espacio bilingüe. Hello, everybody. My name is Adriana. I'm here with my compis Vanessa to be your interpreters today and create this language justice space, this bilingual space together. Y la función de interpretación ya está activada. The interpretation function is already activated here on Zoom. Entonces voy a dar unas instrucciones bilingües en español y en inglés para explicar cómo se usa. So I'm going to give some bilingual instructions in Spanish and English to explain how to use it. Entonces, si usted no entrar a ninguno de los canales y oír el audio original. If you're bilingual joining us today, you can choose to just stay off the interpreted channels and hear everything as it is said in the original language. Ahora, si usted necesita interpretación, va a ser lo siguiente conmigo. Si está uniéndose usando una computadora, va a mover el mouse y va a encontrar un globito en la parte de abajo de su pantalla en el menú de Zoom. Ahí puede darle clic y va a hacer la interpretación de idiomas. Puede seleccionar su canal de idiomas preferido. If you're using a computer today, move your mouse so that the Zoom menu pops up and find that globe at the bottom of the screen. You can click there, that's language interpretation, and select your preferred language channel. Ahora, si está usando un teléfono smartphone, una tableta, lo que va a hacer es va a deslizar el menú de Zoom hasta ver los tres puntitos más. Le da clic, luego deslice hasta ver interpretación de idiomas, le da clic y ahí puede escoger su idioma preferido y darle al botón de finalizar. Done. Eso es lo que activa la función. Now, if you're joining today and you're using a phone, a smartphone, a tablet, what you're going to do is you're going to slide that Zoom menu until you see the ... more. Click there and slide until you see language interpretation. There you can select your preferred language channel and click the button done. That is what activates the function. Entonces, voy a probar que sí me pueden oír en los canales. So I'm going to check that you can hear my co-interpreter in the channels. First, I'm going to speak in English to check that you can hear us in Spanish. So if you can hear my co-interpreter right now interpreting my words into Spanish, give me any sign of life. It can be an emoji, it can be a thumbs up, it can be a little shimmy with your shoulder. Yes, I see signs of life. Beautiful, it is working. Chéverísimo. Pues ahora vamos a chequear que sí nos pueden oír en el canal de inglés. Si usted está oyendo a mi cointérprete, Vanessa, en el canal de inglés ahora mismo, interpretando mis palabras, denme alguna señal de vida. Denme un meneadito, un emoji, un corazón. A ver, ok, sí veo que me están oyendo. Perfecto, pues continúo en español. Crear espacios multilingües como este, en realidad lo hacemos en comunidad. Es un esfuerzo colectivo. Muchos de nosotros somos bilingües aquí hoy y aquí las intérpretes estamos para apoyar no solamente a las personas monolingües en español y las personas monolingües en inglés, pero también a las personas bilingües, que sabemos que hay 1500 tipos de bilingüidad, para que puedan participar de verdad en los idiomas y en los que se sienten más cómodos y poderosos. Pero necesitamos y empieza a hablar a 1000 millas por hora, nos van a ver a las intérpretes prender la pantalla y hacer una señal. Les pedimos a ustedes que hagan esta señal con nosotras en la pantalla, porque a veces la persona hablando no ve a la intérprete. Entonces, les puedo pedir que por favor hagan esta señal conmigo en la pantalla ahora mismo. Así les dejamos saber a los moderadores, los panelistas o a ustedes, el público, en la sección de preguntas y respuestas, que por favor hablen un poco más lento o nos verán en el chat pidiéndolo. También asegúrense de quedarse en mudo para mejorar el audio para todo el mundo. Y si va a participar y tiene audífonos, eso siempre ayuda con la calidad del micrófono. También les pedimos un micrófono que hable una persona a la vez. De esta manera, no, como intérpretes, no tenemos que escoger qué voz amplificar. Y bueno, siempre tener conciencia de que si dos personas están hablando como palomitas de maíz, como cotufas, como decimos, que por favor dejen una pausa entre personas para dejar que todo el mundo oiga el mensaje. Igual si hay una pregunta y usted está lista para responder, dejar una pausa de como 3 segundos antes de empezar a responder. The language can switch in any moment in this space. And so I say again, if you are bilingual, we welcome both of your languages, and you can choose to stay on original audio or to hop around in the interpreted channels as you might want. For those listening in Spanish, you might hear the interpreter sometimes end words in E instead of the traditional A or O. We do this using non-binary Spanish to recognize the expansiveness of gender in our communities. It's not an error. Any issues with the interpretation, please don't suffer in silence. You let us know on the chat, and we'll try to assist you. Cualquier problema que usted tenga con interpretación, nos deja saber en el chat y le ayudamos. Muchísimas gracias por su compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje. Último recordatorio a nuestros presentadores que si hablan Spanglish, que es mi idioma favorito, no vamos a poder interpretar eso. Entonces, si pueden terminar una oración en un lenguaje antes de cambiar al otro, o si quieren usar Spanglish, pues sepan que no todo el mundo va a entender todo. Con eso, que tengan una super reunión y aquí estamos en la lucha solidaria.
Thank you very much, Adriana, not only for your work, but for that great explanation. So I believe we can start already. There's something that must be said, of course, for those who are here. Something is rotten in the state of Venezuela. On July 28th, we saw what was supposed to be clean and clear elections. And since then, what we have seen is not only the increase of violence, coercion, oppression, and destruction by the state, but an electoral process that proves anything but fair. This, of course, does not occur in a vacuum. This is not something that came out of nowhere. It has a sense in its historical background and its historical necessities as such. But it is important to say that it has been 21 days since the election tallies were supposed to be shown to the public, and they haven't been done so by any standards, however minimal, of what you have about the degrees of democracy in any country. This is highly troubling. And what occurred immediately after, the repression that occurred immediately after, not only in the imprisoning of thousands, but in the murder of more than 20 people, will be actions that will find themselves comfortable in the most right wing governments in Latin America in the past, like Pinochet or Videla or Stroessner. So, knowing this, knowing that this, of course, as I said before, does not occur in a vacuum, that there's a historical element behind it, and that we need to find our ways in order to move forward and find alternatives to these current elements of oppression, coercion, and destruction into a democratic society, and us as people from and of the left to find alternatives to the current violent situation we're finding ourselves on without ignoring the conditions that we have suffered in the past. So I will give myself, it's like my name is Angel Peña, and I'm the co-moderator of this particular panel. I will pass the baton now to Amanda Gomez, which is my fellow co-moderator. So she will introduce this wonderful panelist that will try to illuminate or elucidate us regarding not only the historical conditions of the crisis and the conflict that we see today, but also the immediate reactions that we find at the moment.
Thank you, Angel. As Angel said, my name is Amanda Gomez, and I'm the co-moderator of this conversation here today. I have the honor of introducing our panelists, Antulio Rosales, Yoleti Bracho, and Simon Rodriguez. Antulio Rosales is a Venezuelan scholar of the political economy of energy and natural resources in contemporary Venezuela and South America, and is currently a professor at York University in Toronto. His work explores the consolidation of authoritarianism in Venezuela based on the control of energy and commodity flows. Yoleti Bracho, thank you. Yoleti Bracho is a Venezuelan researcher and activist based in France, where she is also assistant professor of political sociology at Université d'Avignon. Her work deals with the relationship between left-wing and community organizations with the Bolivarian state, and more recently, she has developed work on gang and police violence and repressive clientelist practices by the state. Lastly, we have Simon Rodriguez, who is a Venezuelan socialist activist and writer currently based in the Dominican Republic and a longtime member of the Partido Socialismo y Libertad, also known as PSL in Venezuela. He is the co-author of Why Did Chavismo Fail?, where he explores the Chavista economic and political project, as well as working class resistance to the so-called Civic Military Alliance and the ruling Boli bourgeoisie. Lastly, we did want to mention quickly that for the first time, we don't have speakers that are currently talking from Venezuela as part of our events. And this is because currently the repression is really intense, and there is a risk that panelists would be going, even among renowned activists and scholars. So with that being said, I'm going to jump straight into our first question for all three panelists, which is that from your perspective, we'd like to know, how do we get to the point where we're at right now?
Should I be the one starting?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, thank you so much for having us here. I'm really glad to be able to share with some of you ideas that we've been working on for some time, and also our analysis and observations on what's going on in the current juncture. So how do we get to this point, right? How do we get to a point of what seems to be a massive fraud and subsequently a very crude and heavy, quite fierce repression toward all sorts of different sectors of society, both the leadership of the political leadership of the opposition, as well as different activists and popular sectors as well. So how do we get to this point? I was in Venezuela right before the election, and during my interviews and conversations with different political actors, one of the things that we came as a conclusion was that the government actually thought before the election that they could organize an electoral event where different rules of the game and different guarantees would be put in place, where they would have enough advantages and where they could use different extra legal mechanisms and actually win the election without having to change the result of the election. So the idea was to do what came to become a common language in Venezuela, use electoral engineering, ingeniería electoral at home, to quote unquote slice the vote of the opposition, or rebanar el voto de la oposición. And the idea was to use different forms of intimidation, harassment, different threats of different groups that that they would not receive their benefits or their food subsidies and things like this if they voted for the opposition. That's a traditional strategy used in the past, but other things were also at play, changing people's voting stations, harassing them directly once they go to vote, or making them slow down so that they would get tired. But they actually thought that using these different strategies and analyzing the situation of those who were in need, that ultimately they would turn up to vote in their favor. And so they disregarded the most serious pollsters that came out saying that actually the difference was not even close, that the opposition had managed to gather and galvanize a vast majority of support in different social strata, not only in the traditional urban middle classes, but also in the working classes, also in the rural areas, and so on. And this is what actually happened. So the government thought they didn't need to change the vote, but they were willing, and we didn't know that as how far they were willing to go. They were willing to change the vote, the actual vote of the election, and say that the outcome was completely different what it really was. And what we see is a sort of blatant, fraudulent mechanism stopping the transmission of the tally sheet information that is transmitted from each polling station to the tabulation center in Caracas, and stopping that outright, and physically stopping witnesses from obtaining the tally sheets, physically stopping the national witnesses of the political parties from entering the tabulation center in downtown Caracas, at the headquarters of the CNE, which is the Electoral Council, and then out of the blue, coming up with a result that they argued to be 51% for Nicolás Maduro and some change, and 44% for Edmundo González Urrutia. But in reality, it seems, based on the evidence that the opposition has provided, and there is no other evidence that anybody has provided to counter that, but there is also evidence from quick counts and other reliable data that actually confirms that the result was not that. It was a 2/3 majority for the opposition and a 30% vote for Nicolás Maduro. So we got to this point with this refusal of the government to accept defeat and to the acceptance that they will use force if necessary to hold on to power. And that is what they've done since then. So they've rejected the claims and the demands, both from the Venezuelan people, but also from different governments abroad, to release the tallies, to release the results, by precinct, by state, by municipality. And instead, they've decided to go through a judicial strategy. All the powers are subject to the orders of the executive, directly to the orders of Maduro. And instead, they've taken the military out to repress people who protest, both spontaneous protests that came out right from July 29th, especially from the popular sectors and the barrios, both in Caracas, but also in the rest of the country, repress them violently, and repress also the organized opposition. And we can talk a bit more about how we characterize this organized opposition, which is just to say really briefly now, it is a heterogeneous, a very diverse group which is led, visibly by María Corina Machado and the candidate Edmundo González Urrutia, but really that galvanizes a wide variety of different organizations, political parties, but even the former Chavismo is currently demanding similar things, actually enticing people to participate in these concentrations and protests in demand for Maduro to release the results and actually to abide by the will of the people and to leave power. I will leave that at that for the first round.
Okay, so thank you very much for organizing this reunion, and I'm thinking that it's not gonna be too hard for interpreters to interpret myself because my English is quite slow, so please be a bit careful and bear with me, please. So so the first thing that I would like to say is that we're asking about tallies, about showing tallies that came out of this election, but actually tallies are not necessary if the results of the election, bureau by bureau, voting bureau by voting bureau, were actually published. And that's, I feel this is one of the main things that we have to take in account. Things that, historically speaking, because of the electronic vote in Venezuela, Venezuelans have been able to get very detailed information about what happened during elections very fast. And when I say very fast, it means hours or just a few days. Actually, normally in 48 hours, we should have had by law the results bureau by bureau published on the National Electoral Council website, which is supposed to be hacked. Well, we could go into this afterwards, but what I'm trying to say is that first of all, let's take a step back and say that before asking for the tallies, and why is it that we're asking for the tallies? It is because we actually do not have a precise and quite developed explanation of what happened in general within this election and which are the results. But then, putting that aside, as Antulio, I also was in Venezuela, so the weeks before the election and actually during the election. And so when we try to answer this question about how we got here, what I can say for now is that so I just published a text for the magazine Contretemps, which is a French left-wing magazine, and I called this text "Everybody Knows What Happened." And the idea of everybody knows what happens comes from something that came to be really clear for me while the whole months before the election. And this is that discussing with lots of people from different parts or different sides of the left in Venezuela, and by the left, I'm meaning people that are from the left but never consider themselves Chavistas, people that consider themselves Chavistas but not Maduristas, people that actually supported Maduro at a point but then got out. I mean, I'm talking about a big panel of people who are who claim themselves of being from the left. Nobody, and I mean nobody, during a whole month could calculate any situation in which it would be any possibility logical or mathematically possible for Maduro to obtain the amount of votes that he would have to get in order to win upon the actual candidate of the opposition, or at least what I would call the traditional opposition. And so even though this seems to be anecdotal, for me it is not, because it is also the knowledge of people who have been historically mobilizing in Venezuela in different ways, who have been given their lives into this, into building political space in Venezuela, and who were saying, if this election is won by the government of Maduro, this would mean that it was taken from us. And in that case, now the only thing that would be left for the left and for any actor in Venezuela would be to fight for the right just to exist politically. Not only the right of, mobilizing and asking for rights, asking for a better salaries or, but just the main and simple fact of being able to exist in a political space that can be a space of expression and of mobilization. And so I'm just leaving it here just to say that we should also think that one of the main ways in which we knew that the Chavista government, the Maduro government, lost is because of its own supporters, its own electoral engineering or machinery, as they called it also in Venezuela, la maquinaria electoral, gave us the information that they were losing in their own bureaus, voting bureaus. And so it's not just anecdotal or even statistical information. It's also on the ground, grassroots information that tell us what happened, and I think our doubts are more than reasonable.
Bueno, voy a tomar mi intervención en español, aprovechando que quienes me antecedieron lo hicieron en inglés y teniendo el lujo de tener esta traducción profesional y que gentilmente están proveyendo quienes están traduciendo. Entonces, tomando todos los elementos que ya han adelantado Antulio y Yoletti de por qué consideramos que el resultado anunciado por las autoridades es fraudulento, claramente, quiero insistir en un elemento, que es que el resultado de la elección, aún a 3 semanas de la elección, no ha sido publicado. La Ley Orgánica de Procesos Electorales define la totalización en una elección como la publicación del resultado global y también la publicación del resultado desagregado por cada uno de los centros de votación. Así es como lo define la ley. O sea, esta proclamación de Maduro sobre la base meramente de una declaración del presidente del Consejo Nacional Electoral, que es un antiguo dirigente del Partido Socialista Unido de Venezuela, el partido de gobierno, no tiene ninguna validez legal. O sea, esto no es el Coliseo romano donde con una señal el presidente del CNE decide quién ganó, sino que tiene una obligación legal de publicar el resultado detalladamente y no lo ha hecho. De tal forma que estamos en un fraude flagrante, abierto, y lo que corresponde en los términos de, además, una ley que la redactó las propias fuerzas políticas que están en el gobierno. O sea, es una ley del año 2009, y bueno, simplemente han decidido saltársela olímpicamente. Ahora, recurriendo el presidente al Tribunal Supremo de Justicia, una cosa que no tiene ningún sentido, porque el recurrir al tribunal implica una impugnación de la actuación del Consejo Nacional Electoral. O sea, el presidente estaría yendo en contra, impugnando técnicamente el anuncio que lo dio por ganador. Una cosa que no tiene sentido, más allá de ser una farsa más de este circo por medio del cual el gobierno pretende darse un barniz de legitimidad y legalidad que lo ha perdido totalmente. Pienso que es importante tomar como un antecedente de esto que estamos viendo, de un fraude totalmente escandaloso, el hecho de que en el año 2015 el gobierno, al perder la mayoría de la Asamblea Nacional, perdió 2/3 de ese parlamento unicameral que hay en Venezuela, decidió de facto anular ese parlamento. Desde ese momento ha sido un gobierno de facto, o sea, un gobierno al margen de la propia Constitución que aprobó la mayoría chavista en el año 1999. Un gobierno basado en el control de las Fuerzas Armadas, de la represión, no de ninguna apariencia de legitimidad popular o de legalidad. Desde entonces, además, por el hecho de toda la crisis económica y social que ha sufrido Venezuela, es un gobierno con un apoyo popular francamente minoritario, o sea, que ha estado oscilando entre el 10 y el 20% desde hace ya una década prácticamente, y por eso no tenía ninguna posibilidad de ganar las elecciones. Además del hecho de que la oposición que ganó estas elecciones ha publicado las actas, que tienen mecanismos de seguridad que hacen difícil que se falsifique. Hay otros elementos también que indican que los resultados que ha divulgado ese sector de la oposición es el correcto. Por una parte, para el gobierno sería demasiado fácil, en el caso de que algún acta hubiera sido falsificada, simplemente desmentirlo publicando el acta auténtica correspondiente a ese mismo centro y mesa de votación, cosa que no hace. Pero además de esto, hay documentación sobre cómo, ahora que hay tanta facilidad para transmitir mediante un teléfono celular las incidencias de las votaciones en los centros de votación donde se filmó el acto de conteo de las auditorías, o sea, que cuando se contaban los votos físicos, que son el correlato, ¿verdad?, de la votación electrónica, esas filmaciones de esas actas y de esos conteos corresponden con las actas que se han publicado hasta ahora. O sea que desde el primer momento hay una documentación, ¿verdad?, de ese resultado electoral. Y por otra parte hay cosas muy curiosas desde el punto de vista estadístico en el resultado que dio el gobierno, como por ejemplo el hecho de que la autoridad del Consejo Nacional Electoral indicó que ellos, el primer boletín que dijeron tener, se correspondía a un 80% de los centros de votación. Y dieron unos números que corresponden exactamente a un 80% de los votos que se habrían emitido. Pero los centros de votación son heterogéneos. Hay unos más grandes, otros más pequeños. Es prácticamente imposible matemáticamente que coincidiera un 80% de los votos con un 80% de los centros de votación. Esto nada más como una de las inconsistencias lógicas del resultado anunciado por el gobierno. De tal forma que, digamos, estamos en ese marco. Y yo quería mencionar que aunque el sistema electoral venezolano es bastante sólido, por eso ha permitido la documentación de este fraude, hay antecedentes como las elecciones regionales del año 2021, donde hubo inconsistencias entre el resultado anunciado por las autoridades y las actas que presentaron sectores opositores en el estado Bolívar, o sea que hubo un fraude en el estado Bolívar, y también en el caso del estado Barinas, donde por más de 2 semanas no se publicó el resultado y el gobierno se vio obligado a repetir esas elecciones. Además de eso, lo que se viene haciendo, digamos, desde ese periodo que yo periodizo posterior al 2015, como las elecciones del 2018, las elecciones del 2021 regionales y las propias elecciones presidenciales, es proscribir candidaturas opositoras y sobre todo proscribir a la izquierda, o sea, arrebatarle cualquier posibilidad de participación a las organizaciones de izquierda, vengan o no del chavismo. Como bien menciona Yoletti, que hay una diversidad en la izquierda, desde el Partido Socialismo y Libertad, que es un partido de oposición de izquierda que no se reivindica chavista, que tuvo la legalidad electoral hasta el año 2016, hasta el Partido Patria para Todos, que lo perdió más recientemente, o el Partido Comunista de Venezuela, que es uno de los partidos más antiguos de Venezuela, tiene casi 100 años, y que también se le quitó su personería jurídica electoral para entregársela a militantes del partido de gobierno, procedimiento que también se le ha aplicado a partidos de la oposición de derecha. O sea, el proceso fue fraudulento desde mucho antes del día de la votación, con todos estos mecanismos de represión e intimidación que mencionaba Antulio, y también con la proscripción de partidos y de candidaturas. De tal forma que, bueno, eso es lo que está Ahora, planteado, y coincido con Yoletti, de que para la izquierda y para en general las diferentes fuerzas políticas en Venezuela, resistir a la dictadura es una lucha que tiene que ver con su propia supervivencia y la posibilidad, digamos, de existir políticamente en el país.
To continue with what Simone was saying to some extent, and this is the line of questioning, there has been time in the past which is due to recognize that the opposition has been charged with the idea of like a boy who cried wolf mentality. Whenever the opposition lost, it will be perceived or seeing it as if it was always fraud, not always, never proven. But obviously, what we have as of this moment, it's provable fraud. But this is a conversation that occurs within like at least the rhetoric of opposition in Venezuela. So it's a continuing with the line of that Simone was bringing up. It's like, first of all, what are the difference between previous elections and this current election that just passed in terms of not only the legality or the fraudulent element of it, if it's merely a continuation of a fraudulent path or a breaking with democratic institutions in Venezuela, and moreover, the reaction of the Venezuelan government against popular protests and uprisings and the way of this kind of draconian authoritarian measures in terms of violence and censorship. So in two ways, it's like, is this election separate from others, merely a continuation of an already fraudulent process that had continued, that had started before, and what have been the draconian measures of the government to silence some of these voices that call into the fraudulent nature of these elections?
Yeah, no, I appreciate this question because I think that there is, as Simone was already saying, there is a kind of a continuum, a dynamic of banning individuals, then banning political parties, changing their legal status and giving them up to co-opted individuals that are willing to do the government's bid, right? So we have that strategy happening that it has continued for the past, for several years, but have intensified in the past 10 years. I mean, within the government of Maduro, we have to first recognize, as my other two colleagues have said, the government has been a minority for quite some time. So right after they were elected, Maduro was elected in 2013. It has been clearly in the minority. So the way they have administered that minority has been through different strategies, as we've been mentioning. And what their preference is to have the opposition not participate. So to go to elections that are uncompetitive or scarcely competitive. So they prefer having them either divided, weakened, and proscribed and banned from participating, or having them choose to not participate right away. And in that case, there are also some claims of fraud, even in the case of the Constituent Assembly in 2017 and in the referendum on the Essequibo, where they didn't even release those results, as we are claiming that they have to do in this election as well. So these strategies have been present in the past 10 years when the government realizes that it is in the minority. But there are some things that have changed. Some things are different, right? So this is the first, nationwide election where the government is willing to change the outcome of the election right away. As Simone said, they did that in Bolivar State. They stopped basically in Marinas, and they said, we lost, but then we're going to post facto ban the candidate for governor and redo the election and lose again. But this is the first time they do it in a massive scale at the national level. That's one thing. After applying all these other strategies too. And then what you just mentioned, right? I mean, the immediate aftermath of this is crude repression with very little to no regard for the due process, right? There is no arrest warrants being issued. There is no lawyers being offered that people can bring their lawyers, and there are now teenagers being imprisoned and legal children behind bars, more than 100. So the levels of repression are far higher, and they've gone into new areas of life, right? So right now, people are being surveilled at their jobs. People who go to work in government institutions have to hand over their phones to see their status on WhatsApp. They've been compelled to take WhatsApp off their phones and delete the app. Things that are far more invasive. The level of surveillance is far greater, and the degrees of repression are also far stronger. So we see a desire to disarticulate the possibility for, and that's what I will want to end with, the possibility for a really broad pro-democracy movement, which is what we think is, or what I think at least is, in the process of being produced at the moment, where we see this wide variety of groups, both of the left, as Violeti very clearly characterized, both of the left and of the traditional opposition, being together, claiming for similar things, and also participating in protest on the streets, even if they may agree or not fully with whoever is in the leadership at the moment. They are at least participating together in similar demands, trying to open up the political system for a pro-democracy movement again. So that is what the government is trying to avoid by, resting on pure brute repression.
Yeah, thank you again for the question, and I will try to answer it from also like my research point of view. And so, as we're talking about, so last 10 years, it is very important to see this break in 2015 when the government loses the assembly, the National Assembly, and in the December elections. And then at this point, it's not only that it starts, reorganizing power, and this is the moment in which the Asamblea Constituyente, it's brought up to surpass the capacities of the National Assembly, and we see all of those very publicly actions from the government against the traditional opposition. But it's also a moment of a break within the Chavismo itself, as not only a government, but also as a political movement. In this moment in time, we see how the Maduro government starts taking out of the government people that were the historical allies within the government of the grassroots organizations that are historically in the barrios, historically in the working class neighborhoods, and that have claimed themselves either Chavistas or in one way or the other have been participating within the political participatory policies of Chavismo. So this moment is a big break in which some of the Chavista grassroots feel betrayed because their allies within the government are being taken out, and therefore activists that were working within the public administrations, within the administrations that were actually in charge of participatory policies, were also taken out of the state. We have to understand Chavista movement as a movement that claims that the state is a place in which you have to go and do the political battle. This is what we have called in sociology inside activism. And so at this moment in time, this break makes it impossible, or at least less possible, for the inside activism to being practiced. Therefore, we see something that colleagues throughout Latin America have been calling the institutionalization of participation. And this is a main subject, because if we take back, if we go back to the Constitution and we actually take seriously the fact of the Venezuelan Republic being called protagonista and participativa, therefore, in 2015, we also start seeing a big break within the participatory project that was supposed to be at the center of the Chavista governing. And also a great deal, a big reduction of public investment in general. And so I'm gonna just put a fit on a difficult subject. Sometimes some people from different sectors of the left will say, well, yeah, the break happens and it goes further because of the consequences of sanctions that have been imposed upon the oil industry and that have pretty widely reduced the capacities of the oil industry and therefore the Venezuelan economy. We could go into that further, but what I want to say just right now is that sanctions may not explain some of the decisions that have been made by the Maduro government. And specifically, I'm thinking about the repression of popular sectors during, for example, the Operaciones de Liberación del Pueblo, or Operations to Liberate the People. You would please correct me if I'm wrong. So these military operations that were that came to be around 2015 to 2017, if I'm correct, and that in which the police of Venezuela got into the barrios and did extrajudicial killings that were counted by the thousands within the popular barrios that were historically the historic supporters of Chavismo. And this policy was supposed to be explained because of the fight against insecurity and against drug trafficking. But what we saw is the sad and terrible massacre of young non-white male in Venezuela who have been there for, repressed, not only because of who they were, where they lived, but also because at this moment we start having some mobilization within popular sectors in Venezuela against what started to become this separation, this break-in between the Maduro government and the popular sectors. And so I'm gonna leave it at there, just saying that some patterns of repression that we have been seeing today as political repression that we have been seeing today around the elections actually come from patterns of social repression that this government has been putting in place since around 2015.
Sí, para complementar un poco lo que comenta Giolitti en términos de la periodización, ¿verdad? De la vocación represiva, ¿verdad? Del gobierno de Maduro. Ciertamente estos dispositivos, ¿verdad? De represión a gran escala contra los barrios son un hito importante. Yo también marcaría que en el año 2015, antes de las elecciones parlamentarias, el gobierno por primera vez suspendió las garantías constitucionales. Eso siempre fue un mecanismo tradicional de gobernar en el periodo bipartidista entre el 58 y el 98 del siglo pasado, los llamados 40 años, ante estallidos sociales, protestas, era frecuente suspender garantías constitucionales y saltarse el debido proceso para reprimir. Durante el periodo que inicia con Chávez en el 99, el gobierno, incluso al aprobar una nueva constitución, bueno, parte de su discurso fue que ya no se suspendían las garantías constitucionales, pero en el 2015 lo hizo. Y es muy ilustrativo para qué lo hizo. Lo hizo para perseguir a las personas, sobre todo de origen como refugiados, que vivían en la frontera entre Venezuela y Colombia, a quienes Maduro expulsó por los miles, y en el marco de un discurso brutal donde decía que esas personas refugiadas colombianas eran responsables del contrabando, eran responsables de lo que él llamaba la guerra económica contra el gobierno venezolano, que era la teoría conspirativa con la que trataba de explicar la crisis, que ya en ese momento era gravísima. Y bueno, ese fue el primer punto, pero desde entonces la suspensión de las garantías constitucionales es una constante. Yendo un poco más atrás, me parece que el año 2007 es un año muy importante que fue registrado por organizaciones de derechos humanos como Provea, como un año en el que hubo un salto en la criminalización de la protesta social. O sea, antes de la criminalización... Antes de la persecución propiamente política, con las características que vemos ahora, ya habíamos visto el encarcelamiento o la judicialización de decenas de sindicalistas por reclamar derechos laborales o encabezar huelgas, de indígenas, de conflictos por sus tierras ancestrales, campesinos. Eso fue una política que la inicia Chávez en el pico de su popularidad en el año 2007 y que, bueno, va a tener hitos como el encarcelamiento por 10 años, la mayor parte de ese tiempo sin juicio, del obrero de Ferrominera del Orinoco, Rodney Álvarez, o Rubén González, preso 2 años por encabezar una huelga reivindicativa salarial, o el encarcelamiento por 2 años de Sabino Romero por un conflicto relacionado con tierras, su posterior asesinato. En el año 2015 también es el año en el que es desaparecido forzosamente Alcedo Mora, un activista vinculado al chavismo que denunció hechos de corrupción en PDVSA. Y esto también tiene un correlato en la creación de una legislación muy reaccionaria, muy antidemocrática, como la llamada ley contra el odio, que popularmente la llaman más bien la ley del odio, porque más que contra el odio es una expresión del odio gubernamental y estatal, ¿verdad? Que criminaliza el pensamiento, básicamente. Hay personas que han sido detenidas por expresar ideas en tweets o en las redes sociales. De tal forma que, bueno, se ha intensificado y sistematizado algo que ya tiene muchos años, siendo incluso parte de una arquitectura legal creada por el gobierno ya en años de Maduro. Y una cosa que se está discutiendo ahora mismo, que es una supuesta ley contra el fascismo, pero que es muy importante que la gente lo sepa, la forma tan, digamos, laxa en que se define el fascismo puede abarcar cualquier cosa. O sea, puede abarcar desde ideas afines al liberalismo económico, por ejemplo, se dice que el neoliberalismo es fascismo. Se dice que cualquier idea que implique el uso de la violencia como parte de la historia política sería fascismo. O sea, llegamos a una situación donde incluso el antifascismo podría ser, bajo los términos de esa ley, una forma de fascismo. Esa ley se empezó a discutir este año, en abril, y ahora el gobierno está presionando para que se apruebe rápidamente, indudablemente para tener más herramientas para esa criminalización del pensamiento y de cualquier forma de disidencia. Llamando fascismo, bueno, simplemente al hecho de no apoyar a un gobierno militar ultraconservador, aliado a sectores fundamentalistas evangélicos. O sea, como les decía, prácticamente el antifascismo pasa a ser, bajo los términos del régimen, una forma de fascismo. Y yo creo que ese es el real peligro de que un gobierno que ya no tiene ninguna posibilidad ni expectativa de recuperar el apoyo popular, solo puede profundizar en el camino de la represión y de eso que Maduro definió el 19 de julio como el poder militar y policial. Realmente ser un gobierno que queda desnudo en su carácter policial y se va dotando de herramientas para ejercer eso de manera cada vez más sistemática. Lo voy a dejar por ahora de ese tamaño y luego continuamos.
Thank you. Before we continue with the questions, we wanted to briefly mention, we forgot to mention at the start, that if the audience has any questions they want to pose, please put them in the chat and we will get to those at the end. So feel free to do that. Yeah. Next question that we'd like to ask is, there's brief mentions of a break in government supporters, and we wanted you to expand a little bit on why is Malurismo the minority now, and why is there that disconnect with the sector that traditionally supported Chavismo. Feel like that was kind of touched on briefly, but if you could expand on that.
Thank you for that question. I'll take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing in the past several years, and to just paint a brief picture of the changes that the government has done to the political economy of Venezuela, and how that can explain, at least in part, why it remains the minority, and it will remain so for some time. But at the same time, it can also explain, at least in part, why there is no major break that we can see right now in the top echelons of the government and the military. And due to a very deep crisis that has to do with several things, including the mismanagement of the oil industry, really not well managed price controls and currency controls that were used to enrich a particular group of the elite, a new elite that was being built within the Bolivarian Revolution, what we know as the Bolibourgeoisie. Due to the collapse of that political economy model, even before sanctions were put in place, the Venezuelan government carried out some forms of experimentation in the economy to open certain niches of the market in order to re-stabilize the economy, but also to reconnect these new elites and to disconnect previous elites that were leaving the country, and to have these new constituents hold support for them. And that experimentation that meant the opening of, for example, illegal informal mining in the southeast eastern part of the country, that in ways that are extremely predatory to nature, but also destructive to the workers that are participating in those activities under the control of different armed groups. The government also gave with that intensified power to certain armed military groups in the army, as well as different forms of reorganizing of the economy, opening up of different import mechanisms, the dollarization of the economy as well. Is another important one, but also the reduction and the almost elimination of social policies that were common in the past. Not only different social missions, those famous social programs that Chavismo had put in place were completely eliminated, but also even funding healthcare or public education. It is very interesting because the government says that the opposition will privatize these services, when in fact this has already been done by withdrawing fiscal support for those programs and having living society on their own having to finance, from surgery, emergency services in hospitals, to even a teacher that needs to get paid in order to line up for food, or to get food in the market, in a dollarized market now. So these different forms of privatization and opening of the market has taken place with a very clear political goal, is to remain in power and to replace new elites, economic elites connected to the political elite in certain spaces where they can profit, but also keep the incumbents in place, so protect them ultimately. And the military has benefited importantly here. And the old elites, the private elites, have been either co-opted or threatened, and new kind of bourgeois pro-government businesses have been put in place, given permission to do business in certain areas, contractors and so on. And this is in part of the transformations of the government as well, in the kind of its political economy side, that also renders important unity currently in their repressive side to reject recognition of the result of the election.
Yeah, thank you again. Yeah, I think I started answering a bit of this question before, so I'll try to develop a bit more. So, I mean, either we might find, I mean, either we're critics of Chavismo or not. One could say that at a moment within the Chavismo, who has always been heterogenic, there are forces within the Chavismo that put participation in the center of the project. And by this, I mean that there are actual laws that are passed, there are actual institutions that are built, there are actual funding for different ways of building participatory policies. I'm not saying this is la panacea. I don't like the great magical solution for every problem in the country. Actually, participatory policies within the Chavismo government reproduce historical conditioning for access from working class populations to public services in general. This is a conditioning that has been, I mean, in place in Venezuela even before Chavismo. The condition to access those public services would be to organize. So, for example, somebody who lives in a barrio, in different, I mean, it's different for somebody who lives in a middle class neighborhood when they have any trouble with water or with electricity, and when things were running correctly, they could maybe call the electric company and bring a technical person to solve their problem in their apartment. And in the other side, in a barrio, you have to organize, do an assembly, talk with your neighbors, ask for the ear of a public administration, and then after legitimizing yourself as a citizen by organizing like this, then you can actually access public services. So this is the historical conditioning within the relationship between working classes and the state in Venezuela, which is pretty common actually in other places in the world. And so Chavismo kind of expands on this, but at the same time, yeah, it gives a possibility for those communities, those barrios, those places in which organizations that came from before, that had historical capacities of organizing, took advantage of those public participatory policies and built and helped their communities from there. So this was at the center of the project at a point. And when you start breaking down participatory policies, when you start reducing the state's investment, economical investment on those, but also when you start taking out all of those intermediaries, political activists that came into the state, and you start taking them out of your administration, this becomes a major political break between what was the Chavista historical basis and grassroots supporters and the now governing elites. And again, I'm not saying that during the Chavez administration, this relationship was armoniosa and was either perfect or perfectly democratic. I'm just saying that there is a big difference between those periods. And then when you combine the situation with social repression, and also with the reducing of the political spaces that we've been talking about, and also when you combine it with what Antulio said, the breaking of the political economy of the country and the economical economy of the country, what you have is a population that has been paying for years and years for a crisis that has been built obviously because of decisions that have been done by this government, and also because of things that have been asked for from a part of the opposition that at a point decided or might have thought that putting pressure on the Maduro government by promoting economical sanctions would have been a good way to promote political change. And so you have the Venezuelan population in between forces that try to fight for hegemony with different tools and different situations. We shouldn't put those in the same place. And suffering from the consequences of the political and economical crisis. And this, it's pretty much like a great formula to make people go farther and farther away from supporting the government in place. Because at a point, and I'm gonna end with this, I remember doing an interview in Venezuela while the government of Maduro was explaining the economical crisis as a war. They were saying there was this economical war. And somebody told me, well, actually, if there is a war, they're losing it and we're suffering. So if these people cannot win the war, I'm going to try to find somebody else who could win this economical war. So leave it at there for now. Thank you.
Bueno, yo diría lo siguiente, en un sentido amplio, histórico, podríamos decir que el quiebre del régimen político previo al chavismo, muchos coincidiríamos en que fue el Caracazo de 1989. O sea, ese estallido social masivo ante el cual los partidos del sistema no tuvieron ninguna respuesta política, sino únicamente una respuesta militar. Fue sacar las tropas a la calle y matar entre cientos de personas o, según algunos estimados, más de 2.000 personas, no se sabe cuánto. Pero ante ese quiebre, ese agotamiento, digamos, del modelo previo, es que surge la figura de Chávez y el movimiento que él encabezó. Y por eso la consigna de participación democrática tenía mucho peso, porque era en respuesta y reacción a un régimen que se decía democrático, pero que en el momento clave de la crisis del 89 no tuvo ninguna otra forma de interlocución que no fuera con las balas. Dicho eso, realmente la consigna de democracia participativa que tiene la Constitución del 99 se quedó en letra muerta en gran medida. Si bien hay que decir que en esos primeros años del gobierno de Chávez, por existir una ofensiva golpista que se expresó en el golpe del 2002, en el paro patronal y el sabotaje petrolero del 2003, ese gobierno tuvo que apoyarse en procesos que no controlaba del todo, de autoorganización sindical, popular, barrial. Pero siendo un gobierno en definitiva burgués, militar, no podía confiar demasiado en eso. Tenía que controlar, regimentar, que todas esas fuerzas sociales descontroladas que estaban desatadas en radios comunitarias, sindicatos nuevos, tomas de tierras, etcétera, etcétera, volviera al redil. Y por eso se crea este aparato que es el Partido Socialista Unido de Venezuela, que cuando Chávez lo presenta, y por eso es interesante ese es el carácter que tiene la consigna de socialismo. El gobierno de Chávez no empezó a hablar de socialismo del inicio, sino ya en su 6º año de gobierno. Es un socialismo que es enemigo de la autonomía y de la libertad sindical, por ejemplo. Chávez definió cuando estaba lanzando su partido, el Partido Socialista Unido de Venezuela, que la autonomía sindical era un veneno contrarrevolucionario. Y así los consejos comunales se supone que son expresión de organización comunitaria, pero regimentado por un ministerio. Los consejos de trabajadores, desde su definición misma, se plantea que a diferencia de los sindicatos, no son para pelear por reivindicaciones como los salarios y demás conquistas laborales, sino que se supone que son para cogobernar. O sea que tienen una definición claramente de cooptación. de regimentación, de control. Yo creo que ese modelo efectivamente, como creo que han asomado quienes me han antecedido, está vinculado muy estrechamente a una concepción clientelar que depende de, para poder hacer alguna asistencia social, partiendo de que nunca se propuso romper con el capitalismo, nunca se propuso nacionalizar la industria petrolera, ni trascender de ninguna manera las relaciones capitalistas y dependientes en las que está Venezuela. Lo que le quedaba era la distribución, cierto asistencialismo basado en la renta petrolera. Pero ese clientelismo fue muy desigual, o sea, significó la apropiación de enormes fortunas por parte de esa burguesía cercana o vinculada al Estado y unos moderados, bastante modestos programas sociales. Cuando se acaba ese ciclo de aumento de los precios del petróleo y de los ingresos estatales, entonces hay que recortar para pagar deuda que se contrajo también durante ese periodo de auge, entre otras cosas. Y es en ese momento en el que hay que llevar paralelamente al recorte del gasto social y al recorte de la asistencia social un proceso represivo. Todo esto es muy anterior a las sanciones. Estamos hablando de que las primeras sanciones financieras son del 2017 y las primeras sanciones petroleras son del año 2019 y la crisis inicia incluso con el petróleo por encima de $100 el barril en el año 2013. O sea que tiene raíces fundamentalmente internas en lo que fue un modelo de saqueo que significó la fuga de más de 300.000 millones de dólares en una década, desde el inicio del control cambiario en el 2003 hasta el 2014. No hubo ruptura de bloques orgánicos, políticos en el chavismo durante todo ese periodo, pero sí hubo una erosión de la base social. Y actualmente, pues hay diversas expresiones de lo que ha sido la ruptura. Están las organizaciones que impulsaron una cosa que llamaron la otra campaña durante la campaña electoral. Era una cosa inspirada en el zapatismo, que no llamaba a votar ni a no votar, sino a luchar después de las elecciones, un poco indiferente de cuál fuera el resultado. Estuvo una campaña de sectores de izquierda, algunos provenientes del chavismo, como Marea Socialista, y otros no. El PPT también participaba de esta campaña, que tenía una consigna que decía: la clase trabajadora no tiene candidato, planteando el voto nulo. Y hubo un sector, el Partido Comunista de Venezuela, el Partido Redes, vinculado a Juan Barreto, que apoyó a Enrique Márquez en las elecciones. Pero yo diría que lo más importante en este caso no son solo estas expresiones organizadas y políticas, que más bien han sido menores en relación con o en proporción a lo que ha sido la erosión de la base social del chavismo, que ha sido muy grande, sino que lo más importante, por ejemplo, lo vimos en las protestas del año 2017, que fueron masivas, los mismos barrios que se levantaron en el 89 contra el FMI, contra Carlos Andrés Pérez en el Caracazo, se expresaron en el 2017 y en las protestas posteriores al fraude electoral, o sea, del 29 y del 30 de julio, que incluso unos periodistas del consorcio Conectas lo denominaron como la revolución de los pobres contra el chavismo. Son los mismos barrios que fueron la base social y electoral durante mucho tiempo de Chávez, e incluso podría decirse quizá en la primera elección de Maduro, pero que se fue perdiendo ya desde hace mucho y que la ruptura ya hoy por hoy es total, y esto tiene una importancia simbólica porque siempre el gobierno trató de presentarse a sí mismo como representante de esos sectores, pues esos sectores están en este momento no solo a la vanguardia de la lucha, sino también recibiendo los golpes más duros de la represión.
Thank you very much, Simon. Before we continue with perhaps a little bit more concrete elements, I've seen in the chat people asking, particularly regarding the positions of Maria Corina. We will go into that. I would like to ask the panelists, and Simon, if you can answer this question more individually. and excuse me if it's a little esoteric in nature. As the panelists have mentioned before, it's like there is not only a clear disconnect between the working classes and the government for many economic, political, and social reasons, and there's obviously this dislocated element within them. There's still in the elements of language and propaganda from both the opposition and the government. The word socialism or the language of revolution is still used by both elements of both the opposition and the government at national and international levels. So you would see like corporate media in the United States claiming that Venezuela is a socialist state, in the same way that Venezuela will claim itself to be a socialist state. So it's like, although they're coming from different elements of perspective, they agree within these elements of language that supposedly Venezuela is socialist. Although you guys have mentioned before that there's a clear disconnection between the working classes and the Venezuelan government is not only apparent, it's absurd and vulgar. You know, the rise of new bourgeoisies that control the economic elements of the government. But why is there, from two elements that supposedly are antagonistic to each other, agreement that supposedly Venezuela is socialist from both the government and the opposition and the international media regarding what Venezuela is regarding this revolutionary language?
Bueno, muy
All right.
buena pregunta.
Simón,
La tomas,
¿quieres responder
Antulio.
tú? Sure. I mean, just clearly we have different statements or ideas that we can agree on that are part of the overall left dreams or aspirations, right? You know, a concern for just social justice and equality, some form of concern around what is the public realm or whatever it is that belongs to everybody, and that could be used for the improvement of all. So those two things, and it's clearly something that the government has abandoned, right? So it is not concerned with social justice and inequality. In fact, it has deepened inequality and it has worsened injustices by the practices that we've been describing. And of course, whatever is part of the realm of the public has been privatized by two certain elites and certain groups. So in that case, it has moved farther from these aspirations of the left or of socialism and so on. But there is another point where I think that the media is kind of agrees on with the government, and the government itself self-claims that, is that it calls itself a vanguard, that it ought to remain in power no matter what. And here there will be divisions within different versions of socialism and between different views of the left. Some are more democratic, and some actually claim that to be a good thing, that the government has sustained itself and needs to protect power as the only way and the main way to advance any demands of the subaltern sectors of the population. And in that case, there is some form of agreement there. We could tackle the questions of Maria Corina, but perhaps I would just stop there because to make it just very quick, and then go back to the opposition.
Yeah, thank you. So I think to be, I don't know, maybe a bit theoretical, but I think the discussion about socialism in Venezuela, it's actually like a big discussion on what's the left, what's the relationship between the left and democracy, and where does socialism, has its place on this discussion between the left ideas, ideals actually, and democracy. And so this is a big discussion right now around what happened in these elections in Venezuela. So to be clear, when you go to Venezuela right now, you're looking at one of the most liberal economies in the world, and not overreacting. What I'm trying to say is that being a worker in Venezuela means having almost no rights and no social protection. You're depending, and you don't have a salary. You have bit of a salary, and then your income, if there's any, depends on bonuses that are paid in dollars and that are not you're not having any social security or any of those advantages because of your work. And this is in the case in which you are a worker that is that has a formal and asalariado work. But in the case of a bigger part also of the population, you are an informal worker. And obviously, informality in every case is pretty precarious, but it might become extremely precarious when you're in this economy in which there is no safety net left for everyday people. And this is the largest and most common experience in Venezuela. Being a Venezuelan, living in Venezuela today, it means to have to solve by either private or community or family links and help the things that a socialist state, for example, might have taken on if actually govern as socialist government would have tried to solve, I don't know, inequalities and protect its people. Another important thing, and this is about, I mean, economy, working, and being able to exist in a dignified way every day. And then there is political rights. And if we value democracy, and if we think that socialism should be democratic, then in that case, what is happening right now in Venezuela, it's a pretty obvious example of the diminishing of democracy and an authoritarian consolidation of a government that it's claiming to be socialist. And just to end this this idea, why is it interesting outside of Venezuela to still name this government as socialist? Because Venezuela is also a pretty useful scarecrow. It has been instrumentalized all over the world. We've seen this in the American continent. We've seen this in Europe. It is pretty, I mean, one of the harms that what's happening in Venezuela has done for the left, it's to actually put a stain on the leftist ideas. And it is pretty easy to see, I mean, to show the 7 million people that are outside of Venezuela who, as the Uruguayan person said a few days ago, are not doing tourism, and to take Venezuela as a scarecrow to say that's what happens when the left governs. And so the idea, I think, and one of those fights might be interesting to fight from outside of Venezuela with by helping people organizing in Venezuela, would be the fight of how is it that we can take over the left interpretations of the world and the left ideals without giving in to the scarecrow that sadly Venezuela has become in these last years.
Sí, bueno, todo un tema, esto del socialismo. Recuerdo una vez que me tocó hablar a raíz del aniversario del Manifiesto Comunista en el 2018, que el propio manifiesto, Marx y Engels hablan de diversos socialismos, hablan de socialismo feudal, socialismo pequeño burgués, socialismo que llaman utópicos, y bueno, toda clase de socialismo, y diferencian el que ellos defienden, porque, bueno, la centralidad de la clase trabajadora, su concepción de que es la clase trabajadora la que debe gobernar, como tránsito hacia una sociedad sin clases, en fin, la desaparición del Estado. Si admitiéramos que régimen venezolano es socialista, tendríamos que hablar entonces de un socialismo fundamentalista cristiano, ultraconservador, enemigo de los derechos de las mujeres, que penaliza de manera casi absoluta el aborto, que niega a los pueblos indígenas su derecho a la autodeterminación y al autogobierno y a la autodemarcación territorial, que favorece a las Fuerzas Armadas, o sea, bonapartista totalmente, que no es antiimperialista, que pasó de la tradicional subordinación de Venezuela al imperialismo estadounidense a una alineación con el imperialismo ruso y el imperialismo chino, que no reivindica un orden internacional justo, sin dominación ni opresión colonial e imperialista, sino que lo que plantea es la multipolaridad, o sea, la idea de que la competencia interimperialista sería buena, sería positiva, y que en consecuencia ha apoyado la invasión de Ucrania, apoyó a la dictadura siria de Assad durante su terrible represión que dejó de más de 300.000 personas asesinadas, que ahora mismo tiene una campaña expansionista, anexionista contra Guyana, planteando la posibilidad de invadir a un país caribeño para apropiarse de 2/3 partes de su territorio. Por cierto, que eso fue una política durante gran parte del siglo XX impulsada por el imperialismo estadounidense contra Guyana por tener una dirigencia independentista y luego durante el periodo independiente una dirigencia de izquierda, pero que Maduro lo recicla ese conflicto tratando de generar unanimidad nacionalista en torno de su régimen. O sea que sería un socialismo antiobrero totalmente, como decía Giolitti, donde se niega la posibilidad de autoorganización sindical y política de los trabajadores. Yo preferiría, me resulta mucho más sencillo decir simplemente que no es socialismo, que es un falso socialismo, que no es anticapitalista, que no es antiimperialista, y que es un modelo básicamente de dominación capitalista, pero con elementos de los más brutales y salvajes de saqueo y explotación. Es obvio por qué para la derecha decir que Venezuela es el destino de cualquier proyecto de izquierda, pues es muy conveniente. Sería extraño que no lo hicieran, es demasiado fácil. Pero al mismo tiempo, yo creo que desde el otro lado, quienes desde la izquierda internacional equivocadamente apoyan al gobierno venezolano, lo hacen bajo una lógica extrema campista que plantea que todo lo que no esté directamente alineado a Estados Unidos es positivo, que hay que apoyarlo. Y bueno, en ese afán llegan a la exageración de decir que Venezuela sería un proyecto socialista o antiimperialista. Pero bueno, simplemente para ilustrar, a tal punto no lo es, que recientemente con la controversia del fraude electoral, el presidente Maduro dijo que si Estados Unidos no reconocía, digamos, su triunfo, le entregaría las concesiones petroleras que le ha dado a empresas estadounidenses como Chevron a empresas transnacionales de los países BRICS, o sea, de Brasil, Rusia, Sudáfrica, China y la India. Bueno, eso demuestra que ni le cruza por la cabeza la posibilidad de que el pueblo venezolano pueda disponer de su propia industria petrolera. Para él el dilema está entre ser básicamente una semicolonia en el sentido económico de Estados Unidos o de otras potencias imperialistas. No se le ocurre ninguna otra posibilidad. Entonces su horizonte estratégico es ese, es continuar el saqueo, incluso en el contexto actual de lo que significa, digamos, el desafío de superar economías basadas en las energías fósiles, pues la apuesta del gobierno venezolano es continuar siendo una semicolonia petrolera y bueno, me parece que es importante desenmascarar eso. Por eso gestos como sectores del nuevo Frente Popular francés o del Frente de Izquierda de los Trabajadores de Argentina también algún sector de la izquierda en Perú, que se han pronunciado contra el fraude y la represión de Maduro, sirve para tumbar esa máscara de falso socialismo que todavía pretenden tener los militares y los boliburgueses.
Thank you for that. Angel, I'm good. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I saw you turned on your mic. So, okay. The conversation is really good right now, but sadly, we will be moving on towards the wrap up. There's definitely a lot that we could be going on about here, but in the interest of respecting everyone's time, we will ask some specific questions for each panelist, and then maybe just one more question based on what we're seeing from the audience, and then we will wrap up. So with that being said, we will ask specifically Yoleti. There are many differences amongst the left, evidently. But what are the potential points of unity that we have, and what have been the experiences of coalition building like? What can the left offer that can help address the Venezuelan crises at its multiple levels? And yeah.
Well, thank you for this question, which I think, you know what we say in Spanish, si supiera la respuesta sería millonaria. If I knew the answer, I would be a millionaire. No, to be serious about this, so in my experience, and this is me talking both as a researcher and also as a Venezuelan migrant that has been trying to get together different sectors of the left, either in Venezuela or in France, to talk and be clear about what's happening in Venezuela. I feel that, well, first of all, international solidarity. I actually think that internationalism is one of those main values that we might rescue from what's the history of the left, and as an individual, but also as being a part of a community, I've been thankful of my comrades close to me who have been helping either, I mean, logistically, but also intellectually and politically, to build alliances that have that also like actually allowed organizations, for example, in France, to talk and express themselves very clearly about what is happening today in Venezuela. So first, for example, internationalism or international solidarity, and then secondly, yeah, I think when we're from a left point of view, another point of unity, and right now this is a main discussion in Venezuela, is democracy and the democratic values. And that's why different organizations that actually were mentioned by Simon a few questions ago are now gathering in something that's been called the Frente Popular Democrático, or Popular Democratic Front. No, a Democratic and Popular Front, sorry. And so, and with the idea that, I mean, these organizations, they do not necessarily agree in everything about the political future of Venezuela, or either the political past of Venezuela. But right now, the idea is to say that the fight for the political space, the right to be and exist politically, so the fight for democracy, is at the center of what's needed to be done in Venezuela. And so I think, I mean, this kind of iniciativas, activities and organizations might be very interesting in the future. And lastly, to not only talk about what organizations are doing, I find that from the left, there is something that's, I hope, can be seen very clearly. The 29th of July in Venezuela, being there, what I saw, it's not people who are, you know, the puppies of United States imperialism moving around Caracas and the country. No, the Venezuelan people mobilized to vote the 28th and then mobilized against what happened and the results that were given in the night. And this mobilization, if we are cynical enough to see people on the streets and say that these people are all just drugged people and that were formed for battle in, I don't know, Panama or whatever. I mean, if we claim ourselves to be from the left and not able to see and characterize popular mobilization correctly, then I think we're going on the bad road. So I'm hoping this is a point of unity, and I think some forces see it as that.
Thank you very much, Yoleti. Something that we have been seeing in the chat is obviously concerns about like the political program of someone like Maria Corina Machado will have in Venezuela, and what does she represent for the opposition in Venezuela as a whole. And of course, there's great concerns coming from the international left regarding this. She's seen somewhat as a right-wing figure. But if Antulio, if you could be, I'm sorry to give you all the responsibility to talk about a figure like Maria Corina. I know it's probably not the most likable topic, but if you could speak a little bit about what Maria Corina's perhaps vision for Venezuela is, what does she represent within the historical elements for the traditional oppositions of Venezuela, and how does she position herself, and not only ideologically but politically, in these current times?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, yeah, it's not the most pleasing thing to have to answer, but just to say that, just to follow up from Yoleti, I think that the core, and I think I wholeheartedly agree with her about the core desire to recreate a space, a public space for political participation and existence. You know, reclaiming democracy, I think, it's a good enough goal for a very wide and just heterogeneous space and movement of different groups, regardless of the leadership. Now, we have to characterize the leadership, obviously, and Maria Corina Machado herself comes from the business sector and from the traditional Venezuelan elite. She has long been a kind of a hardliner within the opposition, and herself, she's distanced herself from the opposition anytime that the opposition political parties moved toward a normalization of electoral participation, of rebuilding majorities with you know, a kind of moderate discourse and moderate political practice. She long distanced herself, trying to paint herself as a hardliner and as someone who is absolutely and completely clean from that kind of new form of socialism, actually, also of the opposition itself. But lately, in the past few months, she has made a strategic turn where she has realized the need to create this broad coalition of people who are disenchanted with the government, who see the concerns of their daily life being constantly under threat, and the need to change it. So now that leadership, that sort of traditionally liberal in the economic sense and traditionally conservative in the social sense, that is kind of what we can characterize Maria Corina traditionally as, has been transformed into a kind of a vague, populist leader that tries to galvanize this movement and to incorporate this variety of people, trying to tone down the socially conservative side. She's been she gave interviews saying that she was, you know, open to abortion, open to gay marriage and things like this. She stayed herself very much a liberal in the economic sense of the term, But as Joleti said, the kind of the transformations that the Venezuelan government has already carried out in terms of privatization and deregulation of the economy are so to an extreme that this doesn't really scare people anymore as much. And so she's remained a sort of a hardliner in discourse that put her leadership at the service of this more moderate agenda that she for long distanced herself with. So she put herself at the service of this more moderate agenda that wanted to create a new majority, that wanted to participate in elections, no matter how unequal they were, no matter how difficult they were in terms of competing against the government. So that at the end of the day, she put herself in the service of that, and we don't know if there is a transition, whether she would be able to continue galvanizing that heterogeneous group, and if she has to do it, she must become more moderate. But if she doesn't, and if she wants to go the hardline way, she will find resistance within the very movement of the 70% of people who've supported the candidate of Edmundo González Urrutia, right? So we will have to see if there is a successful transition, whether she's able to lead into moderation, to open up for democracy, or whether she wants to go for a radical transformation farther to the right. In which case she will find strong resistance from not only the historical left, but also people within the traditional opposition who may want to see, for example, PDVSA to continue to be a state-owned enterprise, for example. There is clear division in this, or clear differences, daylight within the opposition about these topics. And so if she's smart enough, and if a transition is accomplished, my view is that if that happens, it will be a rather fragile, a rather volatile type of government that will need to remain in connection with these different, very diverse groups in order to sustain itself for any meaningful period of time, and to then allow for a more diverse sort of political system to reemerge.
Thank you. I believe now we will move on to concluding. So we'd like to thank the panelists once again for being here. And this is clearly a very meaty discussion that might need to be continued in the second part. I think we'd like to give the panelists a moment to offer any concluding statements if there was something that you really wanted to finalize with from your points of view. We'll give you a couple minutes here to do that, and then some words from Venezuelan Worker Solidarity, and then we will wrap up. So any last thoughts from Antulio, Simon, or Yoleti? Yoleti, yes?
Yeah, no, I just, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you. And so I just wanted to say, I mean, really thank you for this moment. And I mean, being outside of Venezuela, and what you said at a point at the beginning about people who were not able to talk from Venezuela, I do feel, and this would be like maybe my last hope and message, it is that organizing from outside, it's also a way in which we help the building of that political space that we all hope that exists inside. And so, because one of the questions is what should we do, what we could do for helping, and etc. And for me, this is a main idea. I think organizing on the outside is giving, and I mean not only in public speaking, but also in concrete solidarity, and we all know ways in which we can do that. It's a great way to support the fight that is being fought in Venezuela, which is not an easy one, as you all know. Thank you. Thank you again.
Simon, would you like to have some finishing remarks regarding some sort of conclusive elements of the questions that were asked? Any final remarks regarding what has been discussed today? Anything that you would like to end with?
Sí, me parece que si algo debemos llevarnos, ¿verdad?, de este intercambio, es que por lo menos, bueno, hay una importante parte de del espectro político venezolano y de la izquierda que parte de una oposición de izquierda, ¿verdad?, al gobierno de Venezuela, que no considera que el gobierno venezolano sea socialista ni de izquierda. Y bueno, hay varias oposiciones, no es una única oposición, y el gobierno es difícil caracterizarlo como revolucionario socialista o antiimperialista. El fenómeno, ¿verdad?, político y social de lo que significó la gran movilización posterior a las elecciones, o incluso el hecho de que muchísima gente fuera a votar el 28, no estuvo centrado en el apoyo a un programa político determinado. De hecho, Edmundo González era una figura prácticamente desconocida antes de que se postulara como candidato. Se postuló luego de un proceso de descarte donde el gobierno fue vetando a las distintas personas que podían tener un rol dirigente. O sea que no fueron votos realmente de González, ni tampoco por un programa, porque él casi no habló de un programa. Lo que fue un voto contra el gobierno, un voto. Y en ese sentido, por eso cuando se habla de, bueno, el temor, ¿qué podría pasar si llega Machado? Pues por lo pronto no va a llegar, no está en el poder. El que está reprimiendo es Maduro, el que está asesinando, secuestrando personas es Maduro, el que ha privatizado y convertido a la economía venezolana en un coto de mafias es Maduro. Ya si llega Machado al poder o no, bueno, tendrán que pasar muchas cosas y la forma como llegue, si es que llega, será determinante. A mí me parece que lo que está planteando ahora mismo, en el sentido de que confía en las negociaciones internacionales, llamados a lo que llaman comunidad internacional, etcétera, etcétera, va replicando una estrategia que ya fracasó en el pasado con Guaidó, con Leopoldo López, con Capriles, la idea de que nos van a salvar desde afuera. Yo creo que nadie va a salvar al pueblo venezolano, solo el pueblo mismo puede salvarse. Y en definitiva, pues también cómo caiga una dictadura es determinante para el futuro del país. No es lo mismo en Argentina, donde cayó la Junta Militar por la fuerza de la movilización popular y realmente se abrieron espacios importantes para los derechos democráticos de los trabajadores del pueblo, que estas otras transiciones pactadas como en el Estado español o en Chile. Y además en este caso no hay ninguna pista, ningún indicio de que los militares de Venezuela estén interesados en una salida negociada. O sea que prácticamente lo que queda es la vía de Bangladesh, la vía de Birmania, la vía de las insurgencias populares, masivas, en contra de un régimen como única forma de salir de ella. Realmente las sanciones o la presión internacional me parece que no van a tener un efecto determinado. En ese sentido, entonces, sí llamar a que los activistas, la izquierda internacional, tome esa definición y se ubique desde el punto de vista de la perspectiva de la clase trabajadora y los sectores populares venezolanos en su justa lucha por sus derechos políticos y económicos y sociales.
Antulio, some last words of some concluding remarks, perhaps, that you would like to end with?
No, thank you so much. And thank you so much for opening up for this space that is so diverse and encouraging. And I would just want to echo what both Joleti and Simon have said. It is important to count on the solidarity of people, the eyes of different people from the left, progressives, and so on, to see what's going on in Venezuela and to be able to see and recreate a narrative that where people are located matter. And the claims and the demands of the Venezuelan people also matter beyond whatever the government calls itself. And so I just want to thank you guys for this opportunity.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todas las personas que se conectaron aquí para ser parte de esta conversación hoy en día. De parte de Venezuelan Workers Solidarity, queremos decir muchas gracias por apoyar esta charla hoy. Muchas gracias a los panelistas por darnos su tiempo para ser parte de esta conversación y pues definitivamente hay que continuar la conversación. Hay muchas cosas más que podríamos decir y que quizás lo haremos en una segunda parte. Y para los venezolanos que están asistiendo aquí hoy en día, por favor, manténganse en contacto con nosotros. Pueden conseguirnos en las redes sociales como Venezuelan Voices. También tenemos un blog, venezuelanvoices.org. Y por favor, comuníquense con nosotros si quieren ser parte de otros eventos en el futuro, como este que pasó hoy en día. Y ¿qué más? No sé, ¿quieres decir algo más, Ángel?
Bueno, sí, like, thank you very much for everyone who obviously joined us, for all the questions that they put in. Obviously, this is, as you said before, Amanda, this is a very meaty and a big subject. And of course, perhaps we need a little bit more time in order to address all of the questions that were put in. But the fact that there was such interest and such curiosity and critique and self-critique is very important in the way that we understand ourselves and the struggle in favor for any type of democratic transition and democratic institutions, particularly in Venezuela. So I wanted to thank everyone who participated in this panel today, not only the panelists, but the audience with their questions, Venezuelan Workers Solidarity, of course. And as always, everything that is solid melts into air. So thank you very much, everyone who participated in this. And we hope to see you in a different event and in the future. So thank you very much.
Okay, everyone, have a good evening, morning, night, wherever you are, and we'll see you around. Thank you.
Bye-bye.